Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us on this webinar of the Innovative Medicines Initiatives Project GetReal and the launch of their Real-World Evidence Navigator. So thank you all for being with us today. I'm joined by several of the project leaders who will be walking you through the Navigator today, and this includes Sarah Garner, Paul Janssen, and Heather Stegenka of the National Institutes of Health and Care Excellence, NICE in the UK, as well as Mike Chambers from MC Healthcare Evaluation and Rob Thwaites of Takeda. Good afternoon, all of you. Say hello.
Hello.
So they are here with me, so that's all verified. Thank you. We've had several hundred folks register. We've had close to 400 registrations today. It will be impossible for us to open the microphones. So in order for us to interact with you, we will be taking questions and seeking your feedback on the tool as we go through the presentations today. So you can ask a question in the question log, and we will be taking questions. If you're having audio issues, you have the option of going between phone call and computer audio. We assume most of you right now are using the computer audio setting. You can switch to the phone. We've provided 20 phone numbers for you to dial internationally. So please feel free to call in if you're having issues, and we will work with you to get your audio sorted out. So with that, I am now going to pass to Sarah Garner, who will be introducing the Navigator. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. So my first slide, we just thought it was important to set the scene and explain a little bit about the funding for this project. The funding's been provided through Europe's Innovative Medicines Initiative, or IMI. IMI is, I think it's the world's largest public-private partnership. The money comes from the European Commission and the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associates. The FPA put resources in kind into the pot, and the European Commission then matches it with money to pay for the public partnership, so it's the academics and the policy makers. And it provides a unique platform for allowing that collaboration. Most funding's generally geared towards academics, and by involving other stakeholders, it enables us to take the research out of the academic environment and to actually test it out in a business setting, and also look at the needs of the policy partners, so the regulators, HTA, organisations and payers, and really make sure what we're doing is fit for purpose for everybody and can actually find some solutions. So GetReal marked a bit of a change in how IMI was operating. Very much the early projects were focused around research, whereas this is the first one that really involved the policy partners. And the reason why we had those policy partners' involvement is this sort of increasingly public debate around access and evidence to new medicines. So on the one hand, lots of very promising, exciting medicines coming through the pharma pipelines, healthcare systems under pressure, regulators worried about the safety. So the need for this was very evident, that we need to find better ways of balancing that access versus evidence. So for many products, the RCT investments, large investments, it might not be appropriate, particularly for rare diseases. Might be very difficult to get those populations. So we have to think more cleverly about how we're using data and what we're using to make those decisions, and really sort of make more opportunity of the IT infrastructures that are being put in place and those data capabilities to actually capture what's happening in real life. And one of the issues particularly, so this is one of the reasons NICE got involved, is that we've been seeing traditionally data from the regulatory paradigm, which is the efficacy data from RCTs. And for a long time we've been having to take that data and really try and infer what would happen when that drug got to the real world, the real populations. So a lot of extrapolation, a lot of modelling going on. And it's more and more this awareness that what we needed to do was actually understand what was happening in those populations who are actually receiving the drug. And this is really, I think, at the heart of GetReal and what we've been doing is looking at those differences. So the population in this slide on the left is the RCT population. It's a very standardised population, very high internal validity, but very different, very difficult to know what would happen in the population on the right-hand side, which has got the comorbidities, the age difference, and those are the patients in the population that we really want to look at and understand what would happen. Everybody wants to have a better understanding, but we had the problem that actually it's very difficult to make inferences from data that's tricky to deal with, and we needed better methodology and agreement around standards.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So now we're going to pass to Rob. You're going to continue the presentation. Yes.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you, Sarah, for reminding us why we set up GetReal in the first place now over 3 years ago. So what have we achieved over the last 3 years? And as you can see from the next slide, this has been quite a significant collaboration between companies, agencies, providers, patient organisations, academics. So a lot of different groups involved in this, and a lot of people have contributed to producing what we now have, which is many outputs which will help us in real-world effectiveness research. So that's what we've done in GetReal, but in a sense the real work starts now, because we've got these outputs, we've got these methods, these approaches, and it's up to us now to take advantage of these and implement them within our own organisation. So let me make just 2 points before we go into the detail of the webinar. First of all, thinking about the outputs that we've got, and there's a huge range of outputs that are already available in the public domain on the GetReal website. We've got papers on original research, we've got papers on methods and the acceptability of different methods. We've got examples of case studies that you can use, and we've got tools, software, for example, and of course the central tool that we're going to talk about today is the Navigator. The Navigator is critical because how do we make sense of all this information that's come out of GetReal? The Navigator is a user-friendly way of really being able to get around the information, get around the tools and the approaches. It's not a list. It's a way of getting around it that is that you can understand. It's how you start to think about the problem yourself if you're an agency or you're a drug developer. So it's a well-designed way of bringing together all this information. And importantly, the Navigator, the context or the scope of the Navigator is not just the outputs of GetReal. We've decided to include in the scope of it a lot more information about real-world effectiveness research more generally. And then, so that was the first point I wanted to make about the central importance of the Navigator. The second point I wanted to make was about the importance now of being able to move ahead and take advantage of all these tools and methods that are available through GetReal. As you can see from this slide, the examples in this slide, in companies such as my own, Takeda, we're already using real-world evidence, real-world data within pharma companies during drug development, in the peri-launch phase, and after in post-marketing. But what we need to do now is to think about what we're going to do next, which is how can we incorporate the learnings from GetReal, and how do we think about the changes that means specifically within development, because a lot of the work that we've been doing in GetReal is looking at real-world effectiveness, real-world relative effectiveness, and how do we get that in during development and peri-launch. So this is the thing we're trying to think about now, and if you go on to the final slide, we're going to go over to Mike and Heather, who are going to go into more detail about the Navigator. Mike?
So, yes, Mike here. So, welcome to the Real World Evidence Navigator. Before Heather gives you a guided tour, I'd just like to make a few remarks around how it's been designed and the organisation of the Navigator, so you can get your bearings before you jump in. So the way we've thought about the real-world evidence navigator is that it satisfies 3 or possibly more purposes. The first purpose that it satisfies is being an educational resource for those people who've heard a little bit about real-world data, real-world evidence, and maybe its use in helping to demonstrate relative effectiveness and would like to find out a bit more. We've already heard from Rob, he just spoke about the fact that within pharma companies and within decision-making agencies, real-world data is already used. I think I'd just like to underline the fact that where GetReal came into the picture and where the real-world evidence navigator is focused is the use of real-world evidence to demonstrate relative effectiveness of medicines, and also its use in medicine development, so quite early on, as opposed to the later use after the launch of medicines. So that's the focus of where we're really looking at as an educational resource. And for people to understand maybe what are the challenges, why is it difficult to demonstrate relative effectiveness, what specific challenges or issues can the real-world evidence navigator help us with. A second organizing principle or second purpose of the real-world evidence navigator is as a guide to specific types of analyses or study designs, many of which were tested and looked at within the project of GetReal, some of which were outside the project of GetReal. And these are analytical types of analyses or study designs which are of interest to those involved in medicine development. And we've thought of that in 2 steps. So if you can just click once. The first step, which is called Clarify the Issues, you'll see that a little bit later, really refers to the education resource to find out more, to understand the issues that are being addressed using the real-world evidence navigator. And one more click, please. And the second, the guide to the types of analyses or the range of analyses, links through to what we call step 2, which is find the real-world evidence options in the navigator. So the centerpiece of the real-world evidence navigator are these 2 steps, step 1 and step 2. The third purpose of the navigator is just to become a directory of resources. We thought that this whole territory was quite fragmented and disparate, and it was a good time to bring materials together within the navigator, but also linking to the outside the navigator to authoritative sources. Next slide, please. So who is it for? Well, it's for a range of people, the real-world evidence navigator. Traditionally, we might think of it being used by the pharmaceutical companies, particularly the R&D parts of pharmaceutical companies and the decision-making agencies. But we've had a lot of very interesting input from patient associations and also from clinicians through the development of this navigator, and we think they will find it interesting, particularly as the educational resource part of the navigator, to find out more around how real-world data, real-world evidence may be used. Researchers will find it quite useful to find out what's there on the agenda. If people actually want to use the techniques, they probably need to go beyond the navigator itself to the actual sources to find out how to apply the sources in detail. The greatest value we see of the whole of this program and the whole of this tool is for the navigator being a shared platform for promoting understanding, a common understanding, and promoting collaboration between the different stakeholders and decision makers. Particularly in an area or in an area where there are differences in understanding between different types of organizations between different countries. Next slide. What will we find? What will you find when you get there, when you dive in? Well, these are the sorts of things that you'll find. You'll find summaries of particular types of analyses and particular types of evidence generation activities, study designs, but also you'll find information around particular sources of real-world data and maybe other ancillary information around the governance of real-world data, for example. Not mentioned on this slide, but I think is important, is that you will find examples of case studies where these methods and study designs have been tested in GetReal, and we've received stakeholder views back about the particular analyses. So the views of patient associations, the views of HTA organizations or regulatory organizations about the particular types of analyses or study designs that have been tested. Next slide. A couple of key organizing, it's a bit grandiose to say organizing principles, but a couple of keys of concepts underpinning the whole navigator it's worth just pulling out. One is what we call effectiveness issues. Sometimes we flip and we say effectiveness challenges. We try to become a bit more positive and to use effectiveness issues rather than challenges, but which is really a way in which we're promoting the understanding of the use of real-world data here. What are the challenges that a conventional development program may face through demonstrating efficacy, as Sarah was talking about earlier. There are a few examples there, and these challenges have been organized by using the PICO framework, PICO standing for Population, Intervention, Comparators and Outcomes, to which we've added a further fifth characteristic, which is S for study design or setting. So we classified these challenges by different types, and you can see examples of 3 there. And another click. And the second sort of conceptual parts to bear in mind as you see the rest of the as you go on your guided tour is that we're not just thinking of individual studies or types of analyses, but we're also thinking of the whole program of developing evidence for medicine. We call them evidence development pathways, and you've already heard somebody speak a little bit earlier around the possibility of adapting those pathways or modifying those pathways as becoming more options as time has moved forward for various reasons. Click twice, I think. Thank you. So in summary, you've heard a bit about the Real-World Evidence Navigator, what it is. It is an education resource, a source of guidance, a directory of resources, and most importantly, I think of all, a shared platform. And here's the small print. It's not a decision-making support tool. It should not be thought of as replacing formal decision processes or replacing formal scientific advice. Its use does not guarantee anything. Okay, it's to help, but there's no guarantees associated with its use. Please don't blame us. And some of the methods tested are still experimental. As we've heard from our feedback from various stakeholders, they're still experimental. They need to be tested, tried and tested out there and validated through academics and researchers, but we still think it's very important that these methods are placed in front of people. So we hope that the tool can promote a common understanding. We hope that the tool can promote awareness of what can be done with real-world data, and we hope the tool can encourage the right sorts of conversations at the right time, particularly early in medicine development, as to what might possibly be done and how that might link to different options to develop a medicine and bring the medicine forward at an earliest possible time so it will benefit patients.
Thank you very much, Mike. So now we'd like to invite Heather to walk us through the actual tool and how the tool functions and the various functionality that you can use out there in the world for those of you on the webinar. So Heather, the mouse is yours.
Thank you, Dwayne. So next page. So as you've already seen, this is the home page for the RWE Navigator. Now, as Mike mentioned, the RWE Navigator is aimed at a variety of users, and they all may access the site in different ways. So we've really tried to organize the information in a way that's accessible to different users, who may have different purposes. And the blue bar at the top is really the way to access different information. So to demonstrate the site now, I'm going to go through a couple of examples of different users coming to the site and how they might access what they're looking for. So the first example is, say you're a clinician and you've heard from one of your patients about patient-powered research networks, or PPRNs, and you want to understand if this has been used or considered for understanding relative effectiveness. So you could go to the Use RWD or Use Real-World Data on the top navigation pane, and that gives you a number of options, including data sources, which is what I think you'd go to look at PPRNs. Here you can also look at exploring different study types which might provide real-world evidence, like pragmatic trials or other observational studies, or predictive modeling techniques for relative effectiveness. So if you click on data sources, it brings you to a page describing what real-world data is and giving a summary of different sources. And you can click on one of those to bring you to a page that gives sections covering what is this data source, why is it useful, when might it be suitable, if there are any limitations in providing relative effectiveness, and also has any stakeholder feedback that we've sought through GetReal case studies. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a blue box called Related Links. And this really signposts to authoritative sources, including GetReal deliverables and full-text publications, but also, as Rob said, also things that aren't specifically from GetReal. So another scenario is you might be a pharmaceutical company who has a new medicine, and you're developing your evidence development plan. And you want to know what you should be considering at this stage to preempt any possible issues you might have later in demonstrating relative effectiveness of your medicine to payers or HTA or health technology assessment organizations. And so you can go to, on the blue navigation pane, you can go to step 1, clarify the issues. And this takes you through and explains how and why effectiveness differs from efficacy, this gap that Sarah mentioned at the beginning. Also takes you through what might be the drivers of effectiveness, those things that are driving that gap between efficacy and effectiveness. It also takes you through sets of planning questions to consider for the different aspects of the PICO, and also different methods to explore that gap. So now that you have an idea what issues you might have for the specific medicine that you're looking at, you might like to look for, what kinds of options you might consider which use real-world evidence. And you can go to step 2 on the blue navigation pane. And this is where you can find different things that GetReal has looked at, but also things that GetReal hasn't looked at, to things that could address the issues. This brings you through to a more interactive page where, as Mike mentioned, you can search for things using a development stage and also using the PICOs category. So we have 3 development stages here. We've defined them early, mid, and late. Early being where you're at the stage where you're developing the program. Mid being the operational stage where you're designing and executing the studies. And late being when you're submitting or preparing for submission for regulatory approval and reimbursement. So if we select early, and if we select the population, below, on the left-hand side, you'll see all the potential effectiveness issues that could arise during early and related to the population. And for each issue, it will show you which perspectives it may be most relevant to at this stage. You can click to read more information about the issue. And on the right-hand side, beside each effectiveness issue, there are possible real-world evidence options that could address this challenge. And for this example, the first example is a pragmatic clinical trial. And you can click that box, and that takes you through to a page which we call structured summaries. And really, this page helps to describe what it is, why it's useful, when it might be suitable, again, any limitations, and also any stakeholder feedback that we've looked at. And again, there's a related links box on the right-hand side. A third scenario is perhaps you're an HTA or health technology assessment analyst, and you would like to understand how you could incorporate real-world evidence into your evidence synthesis. You can go to the same Use Real-World Data option at the top of the bar and go to Summarize and Synthesize Evidence. And this brings you through to pages describing evidence synthesis and network meta-analysis. It also explains why you might consider real-world data in evidence synthesis. And then it links through to pages explaining how this can be done. It also allows you to look for different techniques for evidence synthesis that you could consider depending on the type of data that you have available. So whether or not you have just aggregate data, or if you have individual patient data, or if you have both. So we actually looked at using both individual patient data and aggregate data in GetReal. So you can link through here to see a description of the methods and the case study that GetReal did to examine this. You can also link through to references on, for example, doing aggregate RCT, which is obviously not covered by GetReal, but we have provided the sources of information for people to read further if they're not familiar with evidence synthesis. And through this, you can find more information on evidence synthesis and network meta-analysis, and also best practice for doing a conventional indirect comparison or network meta-analysis. The fourth and the last scenario that I'm going to go through is just say you want to learn more about GetReal case studies, which Rob mentioned. And you can go to the case studies selection in the navigation bar, and that brings you through to a list of a number of different case studies. I'm clicking here on the schizophrenia case study that we examined, which was looking at incorporating non-randomized studies in network meta-analysis of RCTs. Again, it brings you through to a similar page as the other pages that give you context, explains the methods briefly, goes through the findings and the conclusions of that case study, any limitations, and again, it includes any stakeholder feedback. And it also has, again, the related links box on the right-hand side. So there is other useful content on the site as well. So within the Use RWD section, or Use Real-World Data section, you can look at adjusting for bias in non-randomized or observational studies, assuring quality and credibility, so it has a link to different checklists for different types of study designs. And in the background section, you can look at different related initiatives to GetReal. And you can also look at the glossary that we've developed with GetReal on different terms related to real-world data. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Heather. That's fantastic. So just to be clear, the tool is available now, and it's up on the internet. So this is available for public consumption for free. So let me stress that. Did I hear that correctly?
You heard it correctly.
That's free.
Free of charge.
That is amazing. Thank you very much. So if anybody has any interest in this, you can use it for free. Also, I'd like to point out we're being joined now by Paul Janssen. Paul, also from NICE. Hello, Paul.
Hello.
Thank you. We have a poll question we'd like to ask everybody out there. As we said, we have a couple hundred of you out there right now, and we're very interested to know what your background is. Can you please tell us where you're currently employed and what your function is? So if you would be so kind as to let us know what you do and who you are, so we can find out what the listeners are out there, and we can see, wow, we're heavily dominated by industry, which is fascinating. We're gonna let this bubble along here a little bit more, and we'll keep that open a little bit. And as well, we're now going to open up the question session for you. There is a question bar, so please feel free to submit your questions that you have. And we're also looking for feedback. If there's any feedback that you've seen from Heather or Mike or Rob or Sarah's presentation, and you would like to say, hey, this would be great to have that in, or if you have any specific things about the tool that would be nice to include in development, please send us your questions or send us your comments, and we'll try to incorporate those in. So now we'll share the poll, and you can see that it's quite like 2/3 of you work for the industry. So 2/3 of the 200 people on the webinar are industry representatives. So I think that's interesting. That would probably be people who would want to use the tool. So I think that's quite compelling.
Well, it's fantastic because, as I said at the end, that the true value of the work that we've done will only be reflected in the way in which it's taken up and the extent to which it's taken up. So I urge everybody from industry, particularly, to make the most of this and adopt it in drug development.
So one of the things we've been bandying around today, and I think it would just be good just to clarify how this tool works in this context, is the efficacy versus effectiveness and relative effectiveness. And I think it's always good to clarify this. When we talk about real-world evidence, often we're talking about relative effectiveness versus efficacy. Can we just define that very clearly right now, how this tool is going to deal with those two issues, please? Who wants to jump in? Thank you very much. Sarah, why don't you take a crack at that? I'll be Socratic.
That's a very good question, Dwayne. I don't know actually how to answer it in exactly those terms. I think what we're doing from the tool is to try and get better estimates of effectiveness rather than the efficacy. We know the RCT paradigm. We've been working on it for 60, 70 years. We pretty much know what we're doing with that data. This is all about the effectiveness data, so data from non-RCT sources. And we know, sort of gut feeling, it's useful. It's telling us a lot of things. We just don't know how to properly analyse it and interpret it.
Do we see a general movement away from efficacy, sort of the randomized clinical trial, to more relative effectiveness evaluation, or do you see it as a combination?
No, it's a combination. It's never going to. We're not advocating. I think as a whole, none of us are advocating that we should start using anything but RCTs to look at sort of inference and estimates of comparative efficacy. That's what RCTs are designed for. What we're saying is there's wealth of other information, and we should be also looking at that. And I think, again, what the consortium is aiming to do is move away. I think there's a lot of historical misuse of other data sources.
Sure.
We've seen bad RCTs, we've seen bad observational studies. So what we're trying to do is raise the standard and make use of the new capability that's coming through from IT, from hospital systems, and just try to work out what we do with that information.
Rob, you want?
Yeah, I agree. I think the development of efficacy data and the development of effectiveness evidence are complementary. There's no intent or suggestion that effectiveness
One will substitute for the
is
other.
going to substitute for the other. That's not it. I think the other point to make is that there is generally an increasing willingness to accept real-world evidence in different types of decision-making, whether that's by regulators, whether it's by individual institutions, whatever. But there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, as you said, we're still quite a way behind in tackling this question of acceptability, and I think that's one of the things that came out in GetReal is that this question of acceptability is still a bit of an unknown, and it's got to be tested in particular cases. So we've still got to work on things like data quality, methodological approaches, transparency of assumptions. There's a lot of work that we still need to do for this to be acceptable.
Yeah.
And the project did actually touch on some of these issues around finding out what the limitations are in terms of robustness and acceptability by decision makers and also by patients, because obviously if you are changing the way medicines are studied, that may have an impact on the patient directly. So we were keen to try and understand that, and that's where the case studies that Heather mentioned were really useful in drawing out the different views from diverse stakeholders. So we've got clinicians, we've got regulators, HTA bodies, pharma people, a wide range of stakeholders in there discussing the actual issues and giving us their opinion around the acceptability of those solutions.
Michael, yes.
Just back to the Navigator, just like the long answer to your question, Dwayne, is in the Navigator. So I recommend people to go in there, look for something called the efficacy effectiveness gap. What mediates between the two? Why do the two things become different? That you'll find in the Real World Evidence Navigator. And just to add to what people were saying, I think we're finding more and more situations where it's becoming difficult to do conventional trials to generate efficacy and effectiveness. And we have to think a little bit more creatively, particularly in rare diseases and such like, around how we're going to demonstrate the effectiveness in reimbursable populations of new medicines when trials are becoming more difficult to achieve.
So we've had a bunch of questions come in. One of the things people are asking are, will the slides be available? Yes, we'll be making the slides available after the presentation. Thank you for those questions. There's a question here from Karen Keating. At this point, is there any information on specific databases related to cystic fibrosis? Do we have anything related to cystic fibrosis specifically?
I think so. There's a EMA initiative that's looking at specific data sources, but that wasn't within the remit of GetReal. I think there's a couple of European projects. I'm looking at anyone else who don't know.
There were no case studies on using cystic fibrosis in GetReal. So if you want to find out disease-specific information, go and look at the range of case studies. That's where you'll find disease-specific material. Not all diseases were covered, of course.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your question, Karen. Anavin Seawick asks us, how can other pharma companies get involved or share the learnings and experiences from GetReal?
This is something that we're keen to promote. At this stage, the experiences that we're going to share will probably be through the usual channels, conferences, etc. But we're looking at an extension of the GetReal project, and one of the things that we hope to do is to find a place where people can share experiences on how GetReal has been adopted in different companies, what the difficulties have been in encouraging large organizations, for example in pharma, to adopt new approaches, and what it might be some methods that we can use to overcome some of these challenges. So I think the simple answer to your question is, in the short term it will be through conferences, but hopefully later this year we'll have some new information on an extension to GetReal, and that should provide an umbrella for this type of activity.
Yes, and
I noticed one question passing from a device company. I think this is all quite relevant. The regulatory environment's different, but a lot of what the thinking in GetReal is relevant to smaller pharma companies, biotechs and devices, diagnostics companies as well.
yeah, and Sophia Marsh here commented that we didn't include device manufacturers in the survey. You are correct, Sophia, mea culpa, and I owe you a coffee the next time I see you. Please forgive me.
And there's no HT agencies in there either.
Well, they were lumped into regulatory.
You're regulated.
Yeah, right. We lumped them into regulators, but okay.
Yeah. So don't take it personally.
Yeah. Will this tool be regularly updated? Will the Navigator? What is the future of the Navigator tool?
That is a very good question.
It is a very good question.
So at the moment we're in the process of discussing amongst the collaboration and with IMI about whether we can get funding for GetReal Part 2. It's going to be a competitive process.
Would that be GetRealer, I suppose?
GetRealer, yes. So there's going to be a competitive process. So what we'd like to do is take that tool and develop it further, keep it updated, really curate it to provide links to other active projects, maybe develop a proper decision support tool to make it really useful, but we need funding to do that. So we're willing, we just need partners, as say, and some funding source to do that.
Yeah, and thank you very much for your question, Ingolf. Antonella Cicciarini. Cucurini, I hope I got that right. I'm sure. Cucurini. How are you planning to promote awareness on the Navigator, and how are you planning to make it sustainable? I think that's sort of partial answer. We're looking for support, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the previous question. Actually, is at the moment I think we're okay for the next few months, but we need a home for this, and our plan is that the extension of GetReal would provide us with the umbrella.
And I could say we're also doing a lot of presentations at major conferences, and there, as part of GetReal, there are a lot of educational tools that are on the GetReal website, and we're hoping that the angels that have been involved with the project will go internally within their organisations and promote it.
And those would be the angels with budget, I assume.
And also to say that there's a lot of material coming out through publications, peer-reviewed publications and so on. So even though the project's coming to a formal end, there is still quite a lot of material coming out, really good material that we will be adding to the Navigator.
And again, this gets back to in some parts to the efficacy effectiveness question. This is from Pamela Tennerts. How can this tool be used to identify where and how RWE can be incorporated into an RCT? So the proportionality of that. I mean, Heather, do you?
For registration?
Yeah, it's what it's saying here for registration purposes.
Well, at the moment, it doesn't provide specific guidance. It's not determining policy. This tool is exploratory into what might be possible, that all the individual agencies will then set their own policy about what's acceptable for what purposes. A number of agencies are interested, actively exploring both in Europe and in the States. So again, what we're hoping to do is, with experience, as our handling of the data improves, as the methodology improves, that we'll be able to add to this and make it really useful.
Go ahead.
Just to say, there's a case study in there that we did around how real-world data could help inform RCT study designs, for instance. So that's one way where it directly affects the regulatory sort of aspect of things. But a lot of the sort of evidence synthesis and the approaches that we explored in the project relate to how you might make the evidence more useful for HTA and payers as well. So it's a combination of the regulatory and HTA and the payers that comes together in this tool.
I think the other thing to mention here is that we stress throughout the importance of considering going for early scientific advice and setting up a dialogue between a company supplying evidence and the relevant agencies. We got from the case studies some useful insights on the acceptability of different approaches and the evidence produced. But obviously insights are dependent upon the specific situation, and it's critical, I think, that if people are thinking about is this approach going to be acceptable, that they go into the dialogue, and they can use these case studies as exemplars, if you like. But it's really a discussion for each individual compound.
Can I just add a couple of things? I think I would slightly rephrase the question as I saw it, that it's not necessarily about collecting real-world data within a trial. It's more around designing studies, designing trials or observational studies to deliver real-world data that is useful. I think that's one way of thinking about it. And the second thing is that, from what Rob was saying, is don't expect consensus about all these issues around the validity, the feasibility, and the usefulness of pragmatic trials or particular types of analyses, network meta-analysis. There are differences of views, and that's why going for some sort of scientific advice process early with agencies to understand where there may be divergences of views is extremely important at this stage.
And then just final point to add on that, we've got to remember that this is one project in a range of projects that have been funded by IMI plus other funding sources to look at real-world data. So, for example, the Big Data for Better Outcomes projects, there's a number of disease-specific projects looking at standardising outcome measures and using data sources that are available in Europe, and actually on that disease-specific basis really putting them through their paces, upscaling, upgrading, and seeing if we can do this in practice now for individual diseases. So GetReal's not standing in isolation. There's EMIF, there's a number of others. What we, I think, all really need to now do is think about how we pull this information together to get across the IMI, and I think this is something that FP and IMI are thinking about, that we've shown, I think, by creating this curated catalogue, curated website, that we can pull them together, and I think we now need to integrate much more with the other things that are coming out, these IMI projects and others.
We have another question from Karen Keating. Can you provide the link to the Navigator? Why, of course we can. And I believe it's right there.
Yeah.
So there you go, Karen. Write it down, please. Go ahead and click through if you'd like. We will allow you, and we'll keep this up for now, for the time being. So thank you for the question. How are the answers in the Navigator validated to make sure they reflect the latest and greatest quality of thinking? Heather, please, validation and quality here.
I can start on, if we're talking about the step 2 or find RWE options. We're very careful to make sure that we're saying that we're not providing the solutions. These are potential options that you could use. And we started by looking at things that were done within GetReal, and we've talked within different people within GetReal, but this is definitely something that needs to be developed further and would go into the sort of sustainability work. For the Navigator. So.
I mean, I think to Peter's question, I think there was a fairly thorough validation approach for the materials that are on there now,
Yes.
whether that's because they reflect publications that are in peer-reviewed journals or white papers that were produced within GetReal but went through an internal peer review process. The challenge for us will be to make sure that the information that's added subsequently, well, there's resources to add the information, and then of course we've got a process to make sure that's validated.
We're getting,
yeah.
we're getting a lot of people wondering sustainability. How are you going to sustain it? How can we get involved? Should they be contacting you through the website or sending you emails to see if we can develop some sort of network and a continuance of profile for this?
Well, there's an option on the website to get in touch with us, so we're more than happy to have suggestions about content and even proposals or ideas of how to take this forward. But as Sarah mentioned, we are in the process, or Rob, in the process of sustainability proposal with the IMI, so hopefully we will get some funding to do this. But we would really like to work with the wider community, either directly or through case studies or workshops to try and develop this further.
Quick question here from a Patrick Mayhe. Do you have any data on vaccines, or is this therapeutic specific? The next point's from him as well. I'm working on advanced and IMI program dealing with benefit risk. I'm assuming BNR, a vaccine. We would be very interested in doing something like your website, but for vaccines. Any plans for vaccination platforms?
I think it didn't specifically fall within our remit. We didn't deliberately exclude it, but we were very much focused on the sort of standard medicines, if you like. There's certainly vaccines have a whole host of methodological issues with development, so I think real-world evidence is a cornerstone of that. We just need to think a bit more carefully about the specifics for it.
You probably already know of, is it Protect, which is the benefit risk? Well, that's complete, but there's a lot of good materials there. In fact, a few of the people from Protect were involved in GetReal, so go there and have a look at that IMI project.
So we've got a few more questions here, but there's a couple other things I'd like to ask as well. From the perspective of the IMI, how do you feel IMI function as a platform for developing this tool in a multi-stakeholder fashion? How was your opinion of that process?
I think it worked fantastically. I don't think we could have done it any other way, and it's got as far as we have. It needed that joint conversation between stakeholders. It's been quite a journey, I think, for all of us, just learning the different cultures, the different backgrounds, and how to approach each other and have a conversation in a very different way than it's been happening to date. So start of a journey. We're hoping to continue in this and other projects. But yeah, I don't think we could have done it any other way.
I don't think we could. I think it had to be a collaboration, because we're talking about new methods, new approaches, and the acceptability of those. And to bring those two things together meant that we had to find a collaborative way. And IMI actually is a good vehicle to bring the different types of groups together.
And for me, I think there's been a lot of, we're getting an increasing call for the agencies to develop guidance. And to me, this needs, again, to be developed jointly. There's a lot of talent within pharma, a lot of expertise that needs pulling out and actually contributing to develop those methods and trying them out. And it's only by getting the data and trying it out and analysing it that we can actually find out if it's useful or not. We can't do that in isolation.
This project is quite unique. It's the first time really in this context that we've brought together so many different stakeholders. So we brought together different pharma companies who are usually obviously competitors on the market, but discussing issues around bringing drugs to the market, issues relating to establishing effectiveness of new drugs, then throw in the mix not just pharma but regulators and HTA bodies. So it could turn ugly, but it didn't. We worked really hard on making sure that we could trust each other and learn from it. So we discussed openly issues and tried to find solutions that relate to real-world evidence that could help address those issues. So that to me is really the key success of this project.
The important word you just used was trust. I think I was very impressed by the way the pharmaceutical companies were bringing forward data sets for use under certain circumstances and sharing analyses and results of analyses. And there aren't opportunities in a pre-competitive and non-competitive way. There aren't so many opportunities to do that. And it was nice being round a table, holding hands, as it were, rather than across the table, which one often is in a pharmaceutical company, facing the folks from the HTA agency on the other side. We weren't like that. We were round the table.
We were, and it did take some brave souls. I think that initially there was quite a lot of reluctance remember in the early days to do that. And it took a few brave souls, Novartis in particular, to start coming forward.
Yeah, I would call out
and
Novartis
inputting
especially.
initially,
It really helped us along the way.
We've got a question here. We've identified Protect, and we have a question here that's coming via email. Could you please give a brief overview of some of the other previously related projects that have led to the development of the Navigator? So some other things that are currently ongoing or other projects that are somewhat aligned to GetReal. I mean, you mentioned big data for better outcomes.
Yeah.
Obviously, Adapt Smart, which is currently ongoing.
We were sort of the first ones in this space, in this sort of collaborative approach.
In Europe.
In Europe,
Well, it was EMIF as well, but EMIF was again very much focused on existing medical records information, how to repurpose it. I think that there's been patches, but there's never been this coordinated approach.
EHR for CR,
There's been ISPOR have had task force.
New
We've
Digs.
seen New Digs work. We've seen the Green Park Initiative in the States. We've had Corey setting up. So there's been a range of projects, but again, the uniqueness about this was it was the multi-sector, the public-private partnership, which I don't think has been done in this way before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think IMI have seen this as a success, and now we have a number of slightly different, some of them more disease-focused projects, but with a similar remit, looking sort of later in development at the role of big data and relative effectiveness. So I think this has moved IMI's thinking into IMI2, where there are a number of descendants or nephews and nieces of this project that are getting going now.
Could I just add?
Sure.
So, and also on the Navigator website, you can go to the background section, and under there, there's a page that summarizes some of these initiatives that have been prior or ongoing.
Just another question here. This is from Patrick Mahy again. Are you thinking to move to a commercial type of website to be sustainable, meaning fees would be charged? So right now it's free, unknown at this point, under discussion, no idea?
So it's a model that we've thought about. We've looked at options for doing this. It's tricky given that so for me it's always been that European funding has actually paid for half of this project as well, and we'd be at the moment very reluctant to do that. We'd have to introduce differential funding for different sectors. I think it would add to the complexity. So our initial drive is to try and find funding sources to keep it open access.
Yeah, open access also drives towards having a more open dialogue, which is what we want. We want everyone to come together, and this could be a seed for dialogue and on different aspects of using real-world data, and that is really, really useful.
Mm-hmm. Does the website tool have a search function?
It doesn't,
Google.
It doesn't actually. We thought really hard about having a search function, and we thought we would try to make it easy to access the information, but we're open to in the future having a search function. I think there needs to be a lot of testing if you have a search function to make sure that it's
Searching what you need to search.
Exactly.
With the time frame being quite short, we were focusing on content, so that's one of the functions we were aware of would be useful.
We're almost out of time, and we've obviously had a fleet of questions here, which is fantastic. I would just like to ask all five of you, what do you think is the major takeaway from this tool? What do you think is the major accomplishment of the tool that you think is going to benefit your position, either at NICE or in the industry, or Mike as a consultant? How do you think this tool is going to benefit the future work that you do? Who wants to jump in?
I'll have a first go at this. For me, this is sort of very much setting the landscape out. So if nothing else, so the worst case scenario is we don't get money for development. This now lays out very clearly what each of the data sources are and provides a starting point and a common reference source, which will live on, if you like, regardless as to what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a pharma company point of view, well, first of all, from selfishly from a GetReal point of view, as I said at the outset, the most important thing for us is to see take-up of GetReal. That really is the value of what we've done. It'll only be reflected in the extent to which people use the tools and the approaches. So I would encourage people not to be afraid to use the Navigator. Everybody in pharmaceutical R&D and many people in other parts of pharma are involved in planning for drug development and peri-launch activities, and everybody can access this, and you don't have to be an expert to make your way around the information we've got, and the Navigator is truly an intuitive way of helping you navigate around all the materials.
Mike, anything you want to contribute?
Yeah, I've sort of said it earlier, I think. The two things I think that it's promoting. One is a common understanding, particularly of these difficult to grasp concepts. The first question we had from you was around relative effectiveness, relative efficacy, what they are. Still there are differences. So I think that we can have a common understanding around that, and then we can have effective conversations across the organizational divides, because we're talking about the same thing. It sounds simple, but that's actually really crucial for me. And the second thing is having earlier conversations, particularly within pharmaceutical R&D, device R&D, and between pharmaceutical R&D and the various decision makers involving the patient and clinicians' viewpoints. But having the right conversations about the potential to use or generate real-world data, but earlier on, at the time when it really makes a difference, and it's not just a fix at the end of the day.
To me, it just demonstrates that the work we've been doing over the last 3 years or so is that it is possible to have that dialogue around these different difficult questions around real-world evidence and the acceptability of real-world evidence. It's possible to have that across pharma, regulatory and HTA bodies, and patients as well. But to me, it's clearly a starting point because we haven't got a consensus in the community around a lot of these questions. So it's a starting point, and we need to continue to have that conversation.
Heather?
Much of what the others have said, just being a common reference point and developing a common understanding or a common language, really, I think that's really important to make sure we're all on the same page about we know what we're talking about. And also, I think just knowing that there's somewhere to come to, well, as long as it's kept up to date, knowing that there's somewhere to come to be able to find access to different information and knowing that it's up to date, if that's what happens.
That's fantastic. So again, I'd like to thank the panel. I think it's been an extremely interesting presentation. It's the first time I've seen the tool. I think it's very exciting. So Sarah, Paul, Heather, Rob, and Michael, I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, and I'd like to thank the 200 of you who registered today and participated and gave many great questions. We'll be feeding back to you, and we'll be sending out the materials, and we'll be following up with an email. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating, and this webinar is now closed. Thank you.